make fun of someone for being homosexual.
And by laughing at other people's sexuality, somehow I feel better about my own.
I think we can probably agree that the American education system is broken, like beyond broken. I remember a few years ago being in high school and even in middle school, it was pretty common to have other students express even at a very young age that they had realized how kind of pointless a lot of what we were learning felt. Like, we would be 12 years old pointing out that no one was explaining to us like how taxes worked. We weren't being taught a fully honest narrative of history. We knew back then, especially when I was at a mostly black school. That was actually the first time, especially after the Trayvon Martin case, where I regularly would see students, or sometimes even entire classrooms of students, refuse to stand for the pledge. Now, I at the time was a good child, and I made a point to do the complete opposite. If only that version of me could see me now, we'd have a lot to catch up on. Jesus. I figured it out eventually though, and pretty soon I wasn't standing either. I also was in ROTC my whole high school career and planned on being a medic in the Marines when I was a freshman. How times change, huh? Regardless, even I eventually started thinking deeper about what I was learning, and contrary to what some expect, that introspection didn't make us better students. It made us worse. I lost interest in what my school was teaching a lot of the time outside of history and English classes, and I, as well as other students, began pushing ourselves to learn outside of that, often while actively rebelling against the school in some small way. Someone call the YLF bitches, we're abolishing bedtimes, and they get really mad when I make that joke, but I hope you guys know that I love you and you do amazing work. I know kids who got good at some art form on their own, kids who educated themselves on history and math by their own methods without help, kids who gave up on education entirely or whatever. At a certain point, there was this air among my classmates of, yeah, this isn't really helping a lot of us. You're gonna have to start figuring it out on your own. I personally got really into photography and poetry, and the first YouTube channel I ever made was a spoken word poetry channel, which I've kind of brought back here, but sporadically. I got really into writing and film, and that was my thing. Everyone stopped learning just to learn, and instead it was like this mad scramble as we all realized we had to learn the thing that would make us money. This isn't even getting into the ways that being neurodivergent made learning hard already. The way my parents putting stress on me gave me nervous breakdowns in classes and made my grades worse. The violent anti-queer hate I experienced in school. At a certain point, I just realized the environment I was in was never really meant to educate me. Not really, anyway. We were all being funneled either into the military, the low-wage workforce, or jail, while a few of us who were able to perform to the standards of the school system, one deliberately constructed in ways antithetical to the mental and physical health of students, got to take on lifelong debt in college. This isn't to say that school is completely useless and teaches you nothing, or to encourage kids to give up. The opposite, actually. What I'm pointing out is that while my school expected us to behave like cogs in a machine and perfectly behave and perfectly recall everything they told us to think or told us was true, we ended up doing something different. While the education system treated us like some kind of object to place the right knowledge in so we could function within the system, something Freire calls the banking method of education, the kids were doing something very different. We were quite literally philosophizing internally and with each other on the nature of our education, asking why we were learning what we were learning, our relation to it materially, its relation to the world around us. On top of that, we were showing active resistance. There was some revolutionary potential there, especially in those moments where we all would agree to refuse to acknowledge symbols of oppression and power like the flag. We weren't just absorbing material, but examining it, asking questions, and coming up with pretty significant answers about it. If you haven't guessed yet, this video is about education, liberation, and revolution. Specifically, it's about pedagogy, and a really interesting book I just read called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This book was written by a Brazilian educator, philosopher, and author, Paulo Freire. Freire was an educator who was concerned with asking a lot of the same questions my classmates and I were asking when we were younger. He grew up very poor in a Brazilian town called Recife during the Great Depression, and by his own account, his education suffered as a result of his poverty. He couldn't learn, and neither can any child really, while he was hungry, extremely malnourished, tired, and stressed. Living in conditions that commanded his attention just to survive day to day made educating himself difficult. He overcame that eventually, though, and went on to study phenomenology, law, and language. But he was eventually exiled from Brazil after being imprisoned for his work. During his exile, he wrote 2 books, Education as the Practice of Freedom and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. His work even influenced other movements such as liberation theology, which I eventually plan to discuss. I got a book on post-colonial theology recently that's going to be a really long and interesting one. Regardless, Freire's book is all about the same process that my classmates and I were going through in middle and high school. Reading it has taught me a lot about what it really means to be educated, about spreading knowledge to further evolution or for activism purposes and such, and surprisingly existential questions about what it means to be human in relation to education. So let's begin by first answering the question of what the hell even is pedagogy? I'm not gonna lie to y'all, when I first started reading up on pedagogy, I wasn't really able to grasp the concept. I have no shame in admitting that I'm just a dumb internet kid, but at times when I'm reading stuff, I just really can't understand it for a while. It was months before I really understood dialectical materialism in a coherent way. This is really funny to me considering what I do in these videos, but nevertheless, eventually I got the concept. To give a very dictionary definition, pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. The word comes from the Greek word pedagogos, which literally means boy guide or teacher. Now, if you're like me, you know that definition sucks, and as much as I love our boy Paulo, he can be a little wordy and confusing at times, surprising considering the book is pretty short. It's like 200 or so pages, though I read it on my phone, so Apple says it's like 900 or something. Anyway, simplifying the thing, pedagogy is just the theory of how we learn stuff and how we teach stuff, exploring methods of learning and methods of teaching. For example, trying to figure out if a hands-on approach to teaching versus a more hands-off listening approach works best. When you're asking questions about how to teach something, when you're asking questions about how people learn, about how people apply their education, what the purpose of it is and such, you're doing a pedagogical analysis. You're doing pedagogy. Even what we did just now is sort of related to pedagogy. The language used to explain it doesn't make much sense to me because I'm not familiar with that academic vernacular, so we break it down to a simpler definition that still gets the word across but fits our vernacular or language better, thus helping us teach and learn. How we learn stuff and how we teach stuff. That's pedagogy. Really simple. What me and my classmates were doing before was also a form of pedagogy. We were stopping to theorize on the ways we were being told to learn and how we were being taught and responding to that. We were doing pedagogical analysis of our classes and curriculum. If you sit down to try and teach yourself something and figure out a method that works best for you, you're doing pedagogy. So what does pedagogy of the oppressed mean? The term refers to the method and practice of teaching and how that relates to people experiencing certain kinds of oppression and how they can be taught to understand and fight it. Paulo says that it is a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade. So what Freire is saying here is that a pedagogy of the oppressed is something created by those experiencing oppression, by taking their oppressive situation and analyzing it, studying it and how it works, and how it affects them, its causes, the ways that it relates to the world around them, and all those different aspects, with the main goal of doing this kind of explorative work, of doing this kind of pedagogy, this kind of pedagogical analysis, being to achieve liberation and thus become more human, which is a little off base of our original just learn stuff about stuff definition. That goal is a really heavy one and pretty hard to define, it's not helped by the fact that Freire doesn't necessarily define exactly what he means by oppression all the time in the book. He speaks in very vague terms and never really brings a specific type of oppression in as an example, except for some explicit allusions to capitalism and some vaguer allusions to colonialism. But for the purposes of this book, however, you can pretty much slot in any form of oppression, whether it's racism, capitalism, patriarchy, homophobia, or transphobia, or any of these things. And of course, we all know that these things are all interconnected regardless. So, let's move on. Paulo Freire has very specific views about pedagogy, humanism, and liberation. Essentially, humanism is the belief in humanity's inherent virtue, human rationality, autonomy, etc. Paulo views our current systems of oppression and their dehumanization, and suggests that the story of human history, our vocational goal or drive, is to achieve humanization in the form of freedom and autonomy. And he posits that oppression's primary function is to dehumanize people and reduce them as beings that fundamentally exist to serve someone else. This is supported by the fact that in many of history's worst occasions of oppression, the oppressed are literally seen as inhuman. Black people in America were legally reduced to and seen as 3/5 of a human being. In ancient Greece, the story of Pandora reflects in some ways the dehumanization and demonization specifically of women in that society. The police often describe criminals as being not just inhuman, but overtly describe them as animals. Hillary Clinton and other American politicians used to regularly use the term super predator as a racist dog whistle for black people disguised as a way to describe criminals. And in nearly all of these cases, the dehumanized were made to exist to serve some form of labor. And the dehumanization enshrined in their minds and in the minds of their oppressors the idea that they are inherently inferior and that the oppressor, often cis white Christian men, were superior. Freire sort of invokes a Hegelian and especially Fanonist idea when he speaks about this, outlining how the oppressor replaces the oppressed person's human autonomy, their way of thinking, their very consciousness and conception of themselves, with that of the oppressor. And he points out something that Fanon does himself, that the oppressed will often take pained steps, even unto self-destruction, to emulate their oppressors and their perceived superiority. To the oppressor, the oppressed are nothing more than objects to control with no agency or ability to act on their own, or whose agency must be violently suppressed for their own good. Among a group of young Antillians, he who can express himself, who masters the language, is the one to look out for. Be wary of him, he is almost white. In France, they say to speak like a book. In Martinique, they say to speak like a white man. The black man entering France reacts to the myth of the Martinician who swallows his R's. He'll go to work on it and enter into open conflict with it. He will make every effort not only to roll his R's, but to make them stand out, on the lookout for the slightest reaction of others, listening to himself speak and not trusting his own tongue. An unfortunately lazy organ. He will lock himself into his room and read for hours, desperately working on his diction. This Fanon quote illustrates the point perfectly. The subject of Fanon's observation here has had their consciousness replaced with that of the white oppressor. There has been implanted in him an internal white critic, colonizing his mind and replacing ideas of autonomy, of the validity of their own language, culture, and history, appearance, and self, with the aspiration for those things to change to reflect whiteness. The same logic can be applied to, say, trans people with cis people, which is a video I've already done, or with the rich and the poor. This is especially true when considering how even when in a capitalist system there are strong social safety nets, those safety nets are still financed by capitalist exploitation, especially when it comes to colonial powers by their colonies, imperial projects, and colonized subjects who will never get to see any of those benefits. This is important to Freire because the point he makes about education is that education given by the oppressor is meant to indoctrinate you, to fit the mold they need. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of a false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. It's something my classmates knew, that my teacher knew, that we all know, but regular public schools are designed to and still meant to teach people to join the workforce and serve capitalism, not gain real valuable education, express creativity, or attain real knowledge, or mount any meaningful change or challenge to capital. I mean, how many of us never really learned how influential labor unions were to senior year of high school in a single day of study? How many of us never learn a real materialist view of history, or never learn the full scope of indigenous genocide, slavery, and anti-black legal history? How many of us are taught about our political systems, but never really taught about the problems inherent to it or alternative political philosophies? We're taught to think and follow, and not always to think on our own. Teaching of the oppressive system is not to foster self-determination, but adherence to the system, the normalization of these conditions. The result of this is that the oppressed, perceiving their conditions on some level, seek not to overthrow their oppressors, but to become oppressors themselves. But almost always during the initial stage of the struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend to themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. This very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete existential situation by which they were shaped. Their ideal is to be men, but for them to be men is to be oppressors. This is their model of humanity. This phenomenon derives from the fact that the oppressed at a certain moment of their existential experience adopt the attitude of adhesion to the oppressor. Under these circumstances, they cannot consider him sufficiently clearly to objectivize him, to discover him outside themselves. This does not necessarily mean that the oppressed are unaware that they are downtrodden, but that their perception of themselves as oppressed is impaired by their submersion in the reality of oppression. This is, I think, an aspect of what Freire calls fatalism. Basically, the oppressed being able to comprehend on some level their oppression, but lacking the ability to see the full scope of it without education and investigation. Lose hope that they can transcend their situation outside of doubling down on their obedience to the oppressive system, or by believing they can game the system and win the right to become the oppressor, even individually liberating themselves by dominating everyone else, which isn't really liberation for anyone. Often when people can see the full scope of oppression they are under, the full weight of the capitalist system, the prevalence of racism that has not changed for us for decades, the struggle of living in poverty and making rent, the crushing and permanently traumatizing violence from the police that many of us, myself included, are very familiar with, you can lose hope. It can start to feel like we're never going to get free, and many people succumb to that. But it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But the purpose of gaining revolutionary knowledge, of revolutionary education, is not to make us feel hopeless in the wake of oppression, but rather the opposite, to let us know how to fight it and inspire hope. Dehumanization, which marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also, though in a different way, those who have stolen it, is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. This distortion occurs within history, but it is not a historical vocation. Indeed, to admit of dehumanization as a historical vocation would lead either to cynicism or total despair. The struggle for humanization, for the emancipation of labor, for the overcoming of alienation, for the affirmation of men and women as persons, would be meaningless. This struggle is only possible because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence to the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. The way to beat this is by making the process of their oppression fully understood to them in all its separate aspects and the bigger unified picture. So for Freire, the process of undoing this teaching and of achieving liberation starts with education, specifically with educating the oppressed on their situation. But this isn't a situation where some wise sage can descend from on high to provide the oppressed with all the right information. The goal is not to think for anyone. Instead, real liberation means that the oppressed have to undertake that process not under some teacher, but with and as teachers. Liberation must be made a process of guided self-discovery, and the teacher themselves is not exempt from this process. For one, the teacher, or in the case of revolution, the leader's role or the revolutionary's role, is as someone who both teaches and is taught. They approach their lessons with their students in a problem-posing method of education, where the teacher gets students to think critically about the lesson, ask open questions, and develop knowledge together as a process rather than just, this is the right answer because I said so. More like, well, why is this like this? What do you think? How does this work? How does this apply to you? Let's break it down so we can better understand it. The people cannot be made into a manipulatable mass to be given directions. For one, hierarchical leaderships like that lose sight of the local struggles of the people, especially in large organizations on a national level. One of the criticisms Black anarchists had of the Black Panthers after their fall was that the hierarchical structure stretched over a national stage began to lose sight of the local struggles and issues. People don't really need to be led like that. In this case, I kind of think of the Zapatistas, or in some ways Mao's mass line, or methods followed by anarchists and volunteers after Hurricane Katrina doing relief and aid. In each of these situations, the leaders don't necessarily dictate to the people what they have to do, but instead emphasize leading by instruction, working with the people to understand their needs and their conditions and their understanding, and work with them to fulfill those needs. The thing is that any group, whether it's students or the people or those under the control of the state and capital, are not static beings sitting doing nothing, but they are a group which is often aware of its conditions, and the goal should not be to control them, but to empower them to self-determine their destiny. This is what it means to be human in Freire's eyes, to gain the ability to self-determine, to understand and place oneself within history, to be able to create and develop their world and mind freely. And this humanization does not just exist for the oppressed, but for the oppressor as well. In gaining freedom from the oppressor and thus being humanized, the oppressor is also freed and humanized, because holding on to that role, being someone's oppressor, dehumanizing another person, dehumanizes you, he who fights monsters and stuff. And in the role of the teacher, it is especially important to self-examine your own role in the various forms of oppression. In this book, Freire is mainly talking about capitalism and colonialism, and he speaks in vague terms, I think on purpose, because his ideas can work when talking about anything from class to race to patriarchy to queer liberation. And when providing liberating and revolutionary education, how the teacher-student and student-teacher, as Freire calls this interaction, relate to each other matters. If you're a white woman and all your students are Black and brown kids, that affects how they relate to you and how you relate to them. If you're a white leftist trying to organize with a Black community, that affects how you relate to them. Part of what Freire is trying to do is emphasize the dialectical relationship between the student and the teacher and explain how to teach from that perspective. Teachers, leaders, organizers, and such should have an intimate understanding of the cultural backgrounds of the people they're working with, the shape of the world that those people live in, and that understanding should come from those people. You're not going to understand someone's culture by just reading about it, but by experiencing it, talking to those people, and engaging with them. Again, not so you can tell them the exact right answer, but so you can help them in the struggle to empower themselves to do so on their own. Students are not empty boxes to deposit knowledge in as we often treat them. This is what Freire calls the banking model, with standardized lessons and tests, and students made to sit quietly and focus all their attention only on listening, often to topics that aren't really relevant to them. In the same vein, the people you're trying to organize aren't that either. They're all living, thinking beings, observing their world and their relationship with it, and the goal is to make that analysis more effective. I think this way of talking about pedagogy that blurs the line between revolutionary and teaching is really important because, for one, there's a tendency for white leftists especially to infantilize people of color and anyone who disagrees with them as well, and treat them like disobedient children who don't understand anything, and a tendency to think of people as static and unmoving and needing to be herded like a crowd of 6-year-olds, when in reality people have their own processes and understandings going on based on their perception of the world, and the goal is to widen that perception so they can better understand the interrelatedness of the world and of all things. And that knowledge can be used for liberation. Then that knowledge can be used for liberation. Kids aren't stupid, they're inexperienced. So in that vein, don't just dictate knowledge, provide experience. Scientific and humanist revolutionary leaders, on the other hand, cannot believe in the myth of the ignorance of the people. They do not have the right to doubt for a single moment that it is only a myth. They cannot believe that they and only they know anything, for this means to doubt the people. Although they may legitimately recognize themselves as having, due to their revolutionary consciousness, a level of revolutionary knowledge different from the level of empirical knowledge held by the people, they cannot impose themselves and their knowledge on the people. They cannot sloganize the people, but must enter into dialogue with them so that the people's empirical knowledge of reality, nourished by the leader's critical knowledge, gradually becomes transformed into knowledge of the causes of reality. This is especially important for white people to know when organizing against racism and police violence. We don't need a cadre of well-meaning white people coming into Black and Indigenous spaces to yell their ideology at us. Black people have our own analysis of our material conditions. Indigenous people have their own understandings. Coming into those spaces to tell them that they're doing it wrong is not you spreading leftist ideas, you're just being racist. If you want to help, Don't come trying to lead, come to follow and work with, to help find solutions to those problems. If you get on Twitter to talk about how land back is bad actually, or yell at black people who don't agree with you or think the same way you do, all you'll do is be excluded from their movements, and to be frank, aligning yourself with the people who imposed those unjust conditions on them in the first place. What I've done here is not necessarily a substitute for reading this book yourself. As I always say, I am a study partner, not a teacher. I highly encourage you to read this book, especially if you want to take control of your own self-education. I think that it pairs best when you read it alongside the works of authors like Frantz Fanon or Amy Shizade. Black Skin, White Mass or Wretched of the Earth are great places to start, because I feel like those authors and similar authors elaborate a little bit more on a lot of the things that Freire is talking about in this book in a more concrete way that helps to further that understanding. Throughout the video, the line between revolutionary and between teacher and student gets blurred, and that's very on purpose. One, because the process of engaging in revolution is inherently educational, especially in our day and age where engaging in struggle means learning new self-sufficient skills like sewing, mending clothes, gardening, cooking, community organizing and self-defense, direct action, and so many other things. Preparing for life in a world where capitalism cannot provide for our needs and survival means getting up and doing it ourselves. But it's also because in our current political climate where Proud Boys are harassing students wearing masks and recruiting boys from high schools, while other students are either not giving a chance to organize themselves or stuck in clubs where organizing means that they're being controlled completely and policed by teachers, or in many cases experiencing hate crimes from fellow students, something I have plenty of personal experience with. Freire's work is more vital than ever to the classroom in its full context. And if you are a teen or a young person and you've somehow made it to the end of this video, first of all, nice, I'm proud of you. But please know that you do not have to wait for any adult to come and tell you it's okay to start learning and organizing with your classmates and with your friends. All around the world, kids are doing the good work, helping to feed their communities. You know, I've met kids on the ground who are 16 and 17, and some of the most competent and intelligent people I've seen. We've seen kids become climate activists, fight for their community's resources, organize against gun lobbies, fight climate change, literally fight police brutality and violence, and more. I was barely 19 when I started, and I was politically aware and active from a pretty young age. And as much as older leftists might make fun of younger leftists and call us anarchists or whatever, the fact of the matter is that a better future for the youth cannot be fought for without the youth at the forefront of that fight. I have seen black children organize and speak against police brutality. I've seen children lead marches against climate change. Your age does not limit you, and none of us, regardless of any age, should stand around waiting for some parental figure or organization to come down and save us or show us the right way. We have to get out there with our comrades and learn together and build together and fight together and not be afraid to make mistakes sometimes, because let's be frank, we cannot fuck up as much as the US government getting 500,000 people killed by a pandemic that was easily preventable. As much as Freire's work is useful, some crowd of revolutionaries won't come down from the mountains to teach us. They rise from the communities they are trying to free. If this view be true, the revolutionary process is eminently educational in character. Thus, the road to revolution involves openness to the people, not imperviousness to them. It involves communion with the people, not mistrust. And as Lenin pointed out, the more a revolution requires theory, the more its leaders must be with the people in order to stand against the power of oppression. Hey, thanks for watching that video. I really recommend reading that book. It's very interesting. Like I said, I don't know if I am the right person to tell you what it says so you can feel like you don't need to read it. I never want to do that. Anything I talk about, I feel like you should look into yourself and do the research on your own as well, and not just listen to me because I'm just a dumb internet kid. But regardless, thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. and you like and subscribe, because that makes me happy and makes me feel like I'm being given attention, which I have a pathological need for. You also can go to my Patreon if you want to support the channel, or my Venmo for like one-time support if you can't afford to be subscribed to Patreon every month. Regardless, I'm thankful that you guys are here and that you watched this video, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Anansi out.